I personally, and our church collectively, owes a lot to the work and character of Bishop John Shelby Spong. We studied several of his books before we first hosted the Good Bishop here in Springfield. And of his 3 visits to our church over the past few years, he's helped us to grow our online audience. He's given us both encouragement and global credibility. And though my book sales don't reflect it, it's nice to have his endorsement on the back of the book. They've never heard of Roger Ray, but they can turn on the back and they've heard of John Shelby Spong. But in truth, my relationship with John Spong didn't start out all that smoothly. Like most pastors who received an academically credible and progressive theological education, I had formed a pretty comfortable barrier between the books I read and the papers I wrote when I was in grad school and what I said and taught in my churches after I was out of grad school. I cannot even remember who first put a copy of Spong's 1999 book in my hands, Why Christianity Must Change or Die. But I know that my initial reaction was very negative. In the pages of this important book, Spong was demanding that people like me stop this foolish cat and mouse game of keeping biblical and theological scholarship a secret from our congregations. It was time, he was saying, for Christians to get honest, to become congruent between what we knew was true in the classroom and what we said was true in the pulpit. I kept getting mad at him. I'd shove the book back up onto the shelf. But if you've ever had a cat and given them a catnip mouse, you know how they look embarrassed at the frenzy they get into and then they walk away from it, hoping that no one noticed, but then they just always have to go back. I kept going back and taking the book off the shelf. I just couldn't make myself believe that there was a way to break down the barrier between the superstition found in religion and the honesty of theology in the classroom and keep my job. And that part was important. That kid in school, house note, keep your job. And maybe I was right, because the more I became convinced that it was time to be honest about theology, the closer I got to being fired and being kicked to the curb by my former denomination. In Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled, he describes the 4 tools of discipline necessary to leading a decent life. Last week we talked about the first 2, the ability to delay gratification and the willingness to accept responsibility in our lives. This week I want to talk about the last 2, which are a dedication to reality and balancing. Being dedicated to reality, honesty, the truth. Boy, that seems so obvious that you'd think you wouldn't have to say that, right? If you can't tell the difference between what is real and what's imaginary, isn't that the working understanding of what schizophrenia is? And yet any minister who's been educated at a secondary, or even a tertiary seminary in the past century, who's still going in public talking about heaven and hell and souls and angels and demons and a terribly judgmental imaginary friend in the clouds, has already crossed the Rubicon into indisputably schizophrenic ways of living. There is a reality that they know inside of their skulls, and a separate reality that they speak out of underneath their steeples. Now, a lot of us have a map of reality that we drew up early in life that helped us to navigate our childhood years. That map of reality may have been crucial to our survival in a chaotic or a dysfunctional home. But when you move into adolescence, or you take on the responsibility of living independently as a young adult, it becomes absolutely necessary that you make changes in that map of reality. Being dedicated to the truth means that you have to constantly examine and re-examine the world in which you live. But Peck makes the point that the examiner must also be re-examined. That is, your perspective on reality Your perspective itself has to be questioned. You have to be willing to question your most closely held beliefs. I remember hearing Scott Peck say in a lecture that anything that can't be questioned is an idol, and all idols are slated for destruction. But if you were told that there are things you cannot question, that this is absolutely true, and you can't examine it, you can't probe it, then the reason why you're being told not to question it is because everyone already knows that it's false. If you expose it to the light of reality, that reality becomes evident. And so people just tell you, don't turn on the lights. Don't look at it. Don't think about it. Don't question it. Don't examine it. But I'm telling you, anything that you refuse to question about your own character, your own perspective, or about the world as you understand it, if you refuse to question it, you already know it's wrong. Now, religion can be especially vulnerable to this refusal to face facts. But in the past few years, we've seen how much this affects politics. I continue to be stunned now, 17, 18 years later, that we went for an all-out war against Iraq based on obviously false claims. I mean, at first, the Bush administration tried to tell us that somehow Iraq was involved with 9/11. That was obviously not true. Then they tried to tell us that there were weapons of mass destruction. We had 200 American weapons instructors on the ground in Iraq saying, folks, they ain't here. It isn't true. And yet we launched an all-out war against them. Somehow the Bush administration appeared to believe Mark Twain's adage that a lie told and stuck to becomes as good as the truth. And in very short order, news agencies were repeating obviously false claims, staring at us through the screens of our TVs in our living rooms, where a huge portion of people either came to believe it or they became willing to join the conspiracy of acting like they believed it. I don't know whether anybody thought it was true, but they accepted that they were scared because 3,000 Americans have been killed on 9/11, so we've got to kill somebody. You know, they accepted that kind of irrational exchange, that we're going to launch a bombing campaign against another country and kill 500,000 people that had nothing to do with 9/11, who pose no threat to us whatsoever. We're just going to go kill them because. Now, in all my years of preaching, I rarely implied on Easter morning that Jesus had physically come out of the tomb in Jerusalem. Nor did I make inflated promises when I preached at funeral services, claiming that the dearly departed was now enjoying eternal bliss in an invisible heaven. But I did speak to my audiences in a way that let them go on believing those things. I artfully spoke above the head of the congregation in a way that let the aware know what I was talking about, but people who hadn't read much theology and didn't know who these people were, they could continue to comfortably believe that I was somehow throwing roses at their childish superstitions. Now, George W. Bush, sitting in the Oval Office of the White House, knew for a fact that Iraq was not involved in 9/11. He knew that they posed no existential threat to our security, but they had been conveniently disarmed. We'd taken away their airplanes, we'd taken away their ships, we'd taken away all of their heavy armament, and if you're going to fight someone, fighting an unarmed opponent looks like a pretty tempting thing to do. But how he sat in the Oval Office and just waved off the awareness that thousands of American soldiers would die, I don't get that. I don't know how he did it. I'm mystified by the ability to make a decision to kill hundreds of thousands of innocent people for political gain. I still don't see how it happens. But what's more alarming is that most of America simply nodded in assent. But he was an amateur compared to President Trump and his revolving cast of White House spokespersons who continue to use this circumlocution of alternative truths to cover for their daily feeding of lies to the public.
Amen.
Now that tax reform is the policy agenda du jour, Trump keeps saying that America is the most taxed nation in the world. Well, now that's a matter of math. I mean, that you can look that up. It's not true. He's had any number of journalists say to him, you know that that is not true. And his reply is always, well, many people say it's true. He knows it's not true, but he keeps saying it. And when confronted with that, he'll say, well, our corporate taxes are the highest in the world. No, they're not. No, they're not. And what our corporations actually pay is typically the lowest in the world. I pay more federal taxes than General Electric. I personally pay more federal taxes than Boeing Aerospace. Our corporate taxes are not too high. They're darn near invisible. But he keeps saying it as if saying it more and more emphatically will somehow make it true. George Orwell coined the phrase, truth is treason in an empire of lies. But now we have a president who openly discusses jailing journalists for doing their job, for telling the truth, telling truths that he doesn't want told. But you can literally be accused of treason for being a journalist in the United States. We've come to expect that sort of thing out of Russia. You know, Putin has journalists killed. North Korea, China, Nicaragua. If you're a journalist, you are taking your life in your hands. But we didn't think we would see it in America. But now we see it in America in a way that is possibly worse than most of the tyrannical dictatorships in the modern world. It is hard for me to believe that this is happening. Now, we're used to politicians telling lies on the campaign trail. They'll promise that they're going to, reopen coal mines or create jobs. You know when they're saying it that it's not true, but we're used to that kind of lying. When Ronald Reagan promised in 1980 to cut taxes and simultaneously increase military spending and balance the budget, anyone that had ever passed first grade math, if you can add and subtract, you know that you can't cut taxes, increase spending, and balance the budget. But he not only was elected in 1980, but 4 years later, when his economic policy had been demonstrated to be absolutely catastrophic, not just to the United States, but to the world, wrecked the economy of the world. And he was reelected in 1984 by a larger margin than he was elected in 1980. Of course, those voters were continually going to churches every Sunday that lied to them all the time. As Voltaire said, those who can convince you to believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. If you can limber up people's cognitive abilities, their critical thinking skills, if you feed them lies and expect them to act like they're true for a long time, you get to the point where you can commit absolute atrocities and they still just nod their heads, almost like dairy cows are like, as long as I get to eat corn twice a day, everything's fine. One of the most important aspects of citizenship, I would argue, is to refuse to believe the lies of politicians. We must demand honesty. We have to demand a devotion to the truth and a total rejection of false propaganda. But folks, we're in church. You got to say the same thing about religion. You can do me no greater favor than to challenge the truth of anything that you hear me say from this pulpit. If you think I have made a factual mistake, tell me. I want to know. Now, those of you who listen to our podcasts and videos, as dangerous as this can be to your church relationships, don't be afraid to ask your priest, your imam, your pastor, your rabbi, do you really believe that? Is that really true? I would love for pastors everywhere to be set free from the cage of keeping what they know good and well to themselves while feeding foolish falsehoods to their parish. When we are in grad school, our work is subjected to peer review. That's part of what scholarship is all about, having your ideas and your thinking subjected to academic peer review. I don't think sermons should be any different. I think sermons should be subjected to peer review. Where we most often fail is in the discipline, though, of a dedication to reality. I meet people all the time around town who, when they recognize me, they'll tell me, oh, I love reading your columns in the Springfield News Leader, but in almost every case, they feel obliged to add the caveat, but I don't always agree with you. I always try to be polite. I like having readers, I don't ever want to lose a reader. But folks, whether you agree or not could not be more irrelevant. Whether you like it or not couldn't matter less. We have equated I like it or I agree with it as being true. Or if I dislike it, it's false. If you want to respond to a sermon or an article in a critical way, let's talk about the facts. What you like or what you agree with not only doesn't matter to me, it shouldn't matter to you. If you don't examine the examiner, if you are not willing to say, why don't I like it? I have had people literally tell me, that may be true, but you can't say it. I had professors at Vanderbilt that would say, we're going to talk about this in class, but you better not talk about this in the church. And I told one guy, I said, don't tell me if you don't want me to tell everybody I know. I'm a blabbermouth. I'm a writer and a preacher. You tell me, I'm telling everybody. But we have come in our society to equate personal preference with the truth. Folks, that just ain't so. What you like, what you prefer, what you wish was true is the single most irrelevant thing in the world. You've got to move past that to examine the examiner. When someone takes me to task about the facts of an article, I always stop and do research and look it up, and I will print a retraction if I'm wrong. But if what they come at me with is name-calling or angry dismissal, so far as I'm concerned, that's just evidence that I hit the nail on the head. If someone's just calling me names or being mad, that just means I got a little too close to their truth. Trump's largest failing is his narcissistic refusal to examine himself. Amen. Now, thinking people already know that President Trump is just full of balloon juice. What is sad is that he does not slow down for a minute to let the fact, the objective fact, that he is a liar work its way down into his self-awareness. Still, it doesn't do any good for us to get all dressed up and come sit here in church to pass judgment on our president or on the Pope or on the Mormon Church or evangelicals if we're not willing to examine ourselves. The last of Peck's 4 tools of discipline is balance. And again, it sounds deceptively easy, but the best illustration that I know for this one is one that you've heard me quote before from Aristotle's book on ethics. And I think it's very prophetic the way he says this. Aristotle writes, anyone can become angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not easy. As Scott Peck says, even discipline has to be disciplined. You can fail to have integrity if you never get angry. if you never let anything bother you, if you're just not paying attention, then you have become a morally neutral non-player, and thou shalt not stand idly by. If you intend to have integrity, you have to be willing to get involved and to get angry. But if you are angry all of the time, then you fail to have any credibility. You become just another crazy person that no one wants to sit beside at Thanksgiving. Balancing is related to the schizophrenic aspect of a dedication to reality. Peck cited one female client of his who just oscillated wildly between absolute isolation and careless sexuality, that she didn't appear to be able to make a distinction between who she should not open her front door to at all and who she could allow straight into her bedroom. One of the most painful exchanges that I've had in recent years was with a church member, and I don't want anybody thinking about who is it. I'm trying to describe a situation. But this was someone who came into our community with unbridled enthusiasm and virtually immediately started pushing me up onto a pedestal, which is one place I don't want to be. I'm a fairly clever boy, but I don't have any confusion about my own failings. So I don't want to be put up on a pedestal. But 3 years later, and this almost always happens, anyone who irrationally puts you up on a pedestal will try to put you under the pedestal eventually. So about 3 years later, there was a complete reversal in attitude. And liberal churches, especially, Unitarian churches, liberal churches, progressive churches, almost always suffer from a fairly rapid turnover of membership. People come and go, and some people come, get their needs met, and unfortunately they leave. And that's their business. I don't have any moral judgment about that. I wish it wasn't so, but it's the way it works. Some people are what we call single-issue church members. They may come for their one thing that they are excited about, and then when they find out that the church is about many things instead of one thing, they will get bored or lose interest and move on. Again, that's their business. But some people, and trust me, I recognize I'm a lightning rod. I write lots of controversial columns. I say controversial things. And very rational and reasonable people can find reasons to disagree with me. I get that. I've never published a column that an intelligent, educated, rational person might not disagree with it. But in the case of someone who's decided they love me one day and they hate me the next, they start trying to find my clay feet, and if they can't find it, they'll make it up. And I confronted this woman eventually and just said, you know, what you're telling people that I've said, I never said. And she said, well, I know you didn't say it, but I know you thought it. And thinking it is as bad as saying it. And I said, well, I didn't think it either. In fact, I think the opposite of that. But she staunchly insisted, I know what you think. And I said, well, do you know what other people think? And when you hear my thoughts, is it in another voice? I mean, are you hearing voices? Because I don't feel like I'm accountable to the voices in your head. I can't say that tactic really worked so far as reconciliation goes. But it is striking if you lose your sense of balance, to your dedication to reality and your balance. I mean, you may not like Roger Ray. There are lots of good reasons to not like Roger Ray, but you shouldn't make up things to not like Roger Ray about. I mean, you should be dedicated to reality, and you should have some balance to say, do I really want to jettison a friendship for no particular reason? Do I really want to do this? Because it begins, if it's not mental illness itself, it at least acts like schizophrenia. It acts crazy, and we should choose not to be crazy, right? In both of these dimensions of discipline, dedication to reality and balancing, we are obligated to keep trying to hit a moving target, because our understanding of reality must not be static. This is why we don't have creeds. Once you express your truth, in a creedal statement, it becomes static and it almost immediately becomes wrong. No one teaches a science class out of a 50-year-old science book. Why do we feel like we have to teach religion out of a 2,000-year-old book written by people that didn't know where the sun goes at night? Our understanding of reality needs to be constantly re-examined, and our understanding of reality changes, and we have to be willing to change ourselves. Our most closely held beliefs are subject to examination. We say that we're on a spiritual journey rather than that we have arrived. I think it's an interesting aspect of the Greek language in which the New Testament is written. No one in the Bible ever got saved. The word for salvation in Greek is never in the past tense. It's always a verb. Those who are being saved, the Apostle Paul talks about. None of us should ever look back in history and say that we're saved. That language would be kind of inappropriate for us anyway, but the point, even in Scripture, is that spirituality is a journey, not a graduation ceremony. Our church is not now what it was 5 years ago. And we're certainly very different from how we envisioned ourselves 10 years ago when we were having meetings discussing starting the church. All of our original members came from a decidedly mainstream Christian heritage. And as we have closely examined the claims of traditional Christianity, we found that we had to pack up a lot of that stuff and put it on a bookshelf marked history. So we reach out to try to gain understanding of other major world religions. And I've studied Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam at Vanderbilt and at Harvard. But what we find when we look at these other faith traditions is you discover that there's great wisdom there, but there's also a lot of superstition attached to it. So you don't just whole hog say, I'm going to import a Buddhist worldview without being just as critical of it as we have been of our Christian heritage. What we have come to accept, though it isn't always comfortable, is that there are no absolutes. There are no creeds. And we have to personally shoulder the responsibility of being forever in transition, looking for truths that we can no more capture. You can't capture and encapsulate truth any more than you can capture and preserve forever the toddler years of your children or a beautiful fall morning. Reality is always on the move, and we are either becoming something new or we are becoming fossils. We are either keeping our faith fresh or we are institutionally becoming irrelevant. My old friend Bishop John Spong was right in his original assertion. Christianity must change or die. What I hope we all realize is the same is true for us as individuals. Our faith has changed, but as progressive as we are compared to the religious landscape, the superstition of other people was never the yardstick we wanted to use to gauge who we are and what our faith is. We are on our own, accepting that giving up on false certainties means that we are choosing honest uncertainty. And in the midst of that honest uncertainty, we must continue to be dedicated to the truth, to striking and restriking a new balance, and continually trying to find ourselves where we are relevant and meaningful and purposeful.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.